So we're talking about U.S. federal government payment systems today. But first, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Federal Grants Explained. Federal Grants Explained is a new video series I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants under the current administration. My name is Patrice Davis. I'm the founder of GrantsWorks Consulting and GrantsWorks Academy. GrantsWorks is a federal grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal grants. On this channel, my goal is to shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding, the funding freeze, agency shutdowns, federal payment systems that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be covering what's happening at the Office of Management and Budget, a very important office to monitor, by the way. And of course, we'll spotlight how the federal workforce reductions may impact federal grants. I'll also feature guests such as former federal employees and other consultants. If this is a topic you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe so you know when the next video is published. And I'm going to start with a few questions. Who is in control of the U.S. federal government systems of the agencies that Elon Musk and his DOGE team have accessed? If Elon Musk and his team are looking for fraud at various government agencies, should he have brought along forensic auditors or forensic accountants instead of or in addition to the software engineers that have accompanied him and others at these various federal agencies? Who initiated the withdrawal of $80 million in FEMA funds from New York City's bank account because of the, quote, feud with the Trump administration over the city's use of federal funds to house migrants? And will this clawback happen more frequently? My other question, if your organization or state or local government agency has a legal agreement, that is a grant agreement, between the agency and the federal government that was obligated or awarded before the current administration came in on January 20th, will that legal agreement, again, the grant agreement, be honored if the funded project does not align with the new administration's policy priorities? There are a lot of people waiting right now to see if the court orders from various judges ordering the administration to unfreeze funds from projects that are not aligned with its priorities will be honored. That brings me to another question, actually. What does it mean for the U.S. if the court orders from various judges are not honored by the administration? And as Vice President J.D. Vance has noted, courts do not have the right to challenge the president. And here's an article from the BBC quoting Vice President Vance. And by the way, there are others in the current administration that believe that courts do not have the right to challenge the president. These are just some of the questions that I have. You may have some questions as well. You can, of course, drop them in the comments and I'll respond as quickly as I can. You're probably wondering, by the way, what these questions have to do with federal grants. Soon you'll find out why. So we've seen media reports about the DOGE team's access to multiple federal agency payments and other systems. It's introduced a lot of questions and a lot of angst for those worried about Musk and his DOGE team accessing, quote, sensitive government data, who reportedly some may or may not have the requisite security clearance needed to access this kind of information. Foreign Policy magazine has called it the, quote, most consequential security breach of the U.S. government, while those who support this action or these actions report it as the DOGE team's efforts to, quote, slash government waste. Fox reporter Laura Ingraham said, quote, it's critical DOGE scour every inch of our government. I have to say I've been both eager and nervous to record this episode about DOGE's access to various federal government payment systems. Eager to learn more, but also anxious because I don't know what this will reveal. I'm also anxious again because as a federal grant consultant focused on compliance, some of what's been reported just seems very unusual, to say the least, because we typically approach these systems with care. We being other federal grant consultants, and other federal grant professionals, and of course, federal grantees themselves. For this episode, we're going to focus on what's happened at the Treasury Department specifically. They've accessed other systems, payment systems and other systems at other agencies, but we're going to focus on what's happened at the Treasury Department. We'll review what DOGE is reported to have access to, which payment systems, and at the end, I'll also provide a summary of some of the other agency systems that DOGE has reportedly gained access to. So for those of you who are not aware, there are 438 agencies and sub-agencies Agencies include U.S. Departments of Defense, Transportation, Education, Labor, Treasury, State Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, USAID. That's been in the news quite a bit about because that agency has been significantly restructured, and I've actually recorded an episode on that. That will be linked below. And another agency that many of you have heard of is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, what are sub-agencies? I'm going to use the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as an example to provide examples of several sub-agencies because many of them are really well known. So U.S. Department of Health and Human Services sub-agencies include the National Institutes of Health, Indian Health Services, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Health Resources and Services Administration, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, and of course, the Administration for Children and Families. Those are just some of the sub-agencies within the umbrella agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Each agency has a secretary, such as the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Homeland Security. For example, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was just recently confirmed as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So Robert F. Kennedy will have oversight and be responsible for U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and of course, all of the sub-agencies that I mentioned below, in addition to others. Just like other larger organizations, agencies also have other offices, divisions, and departments. So there's the offices of this Chief Financial Officer. They have Chief Technology Offices. They also have Chief Information Offices. In fact, according to the federal government CIO Council, the CIO, which is the Chief Information Office, manages, oversees, and makes sure there are governance systems in place for the agency's information technology. Interestingly, there has not been any news in the news section of the CIO Council's website since January 15, 2025. That's 5 days before the new administration came in. Many agencies also have an Office of Inspector General that investigates activities within the agency and activities between the agency and its contractors, the agency and its grantees, and the agency and other external stakeholders. This may help explain why the Inspector Generals, not necessarily the OIGs, the Office of Inspector General is the entire office. You have the Inspector General position, but that may explain why 18 Inspector Generals were some of the first federal officials that were asked to leave this administration as early as January 24th, which was 4 days into this administration's tenure. Anyway, these agencies either have their own payment systems or they have partnerships with other agencies to use those other agencies' payment systems. For example, your organization may have a grant from the U.S. Department of Commerce or from the Department of the Interior, and the payment system that you enter to draw down funds is the U.S. Department of Treasury's Automated Standard Application for Payments system, the ASAP system. So I just wanted to provide a little bit more insight on the different systems that are used within an agency or from other agencies. So we're going to review what's been reported about the DOGE team's access to federal payment systems housed at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and only that agency for now. So what is the U.S. Department of the Treasury? What do they do? I'm going to provide a very, very brief overview. One of the primary roles of the Treasury Department is to ensure the, quote, financial security of the United States. The Treasury Department manages trillions of dollars in payments, including Social Security, tax refunds, veterans benefits, and federal grantees reimbursements from certain federal agencies. All of these payments go through the Bureau of Fiscal Service, an office within the Treasury Department. The Bureau of Fiscal Service's website says it collected nearly $5.47 trillion in revenue through fiscal year 2023 and dispersed 87.9% of all federal payments. I just realized that almost 88% of all federal payments were actually processed through the Bureau of Fiscal Services. These systems hold, quote, highly sensitive information about Americans and non-Americans, by the way, including data such as their Social Security numbers and other personal information, such as their bank account information. So I wanted to set the stage before I provided a rundown of what's been reported about the DOGE team's access to Treasury Department's payment systems or system. So let's start with that rundown of what happened. I do also want to pause quickly to really thank the Revolving Door Project for their timeline and Time Magazine actually for their summary of some of these activities. On January 24th, 2025, that's 4 days into the new administration's tenure, Treasury Chief of Staff Dan Katz sent an email to officials within the Treasury that DOGE team member Tom Krause and his team needed access to federal payment systems so they could pause USAID payments and comply with one of Trump's executive orders to halt halt foreign aid. So, as you know, there have been some activities within the courts about this so-called halting of foreign aid and whether or not it is legal for an executive order to be used to halt foreign aid. By the way, Krause is now the Fiscal Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He is also still the CEO of a company called Cloud Software Group. The reasons later reported that Krause needed access was so that Krause and his team could, quote, evaluate the federal payment system's operational efficiency. So you see the reason that they said that they needed access to the system has changed from halting foreign aid, which was challenged legally, to now, of course, evaluating the federal payment system's operational efficiency. On January 27th, the infamous OMB memo ordering federal agencies to pause all federal financial assistance was released. And you can watch my video describing this process. I will link it below. And then on January 29th, the New York Times reported that Elon Musk and his team of engineers were trying to find ways to turn off the flow of money from the Treasury Department to things that Trump wanted to defund. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that the Trump's ability to defund is being questioned in the courts, and we're all waiting to hear. And of course, restraining orders have been issued. We're all waiting to see what's going to happen and whether or not the administration is going to honor those restraining orders. The former Fiscal Assistant Secretary, David Lebrick, was then reportedly ousted from his role as the Treasury's Fiscal Assistant Secretary after he refused to grant DOGE access to the federal payment systems or system. And then on January 31st, with Lebrick gone, the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, signed off on the DOGE team's access to the payment systems. According to CNN, the DOGE team already believed that they should have had access once their, quote, department was established via executive order, which in their minds had already authorized access because the executive order directs all federal agencies to take, quote, all necessary steps within the law to ensure Musk's group has, quote, full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems. So here is the executive order establishing and implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency. As you can see, January 20th, the day that the current president was inaugurated. And it goes into the establishment of a temporary organization. And this is where it lays out some of the things that DOGE has been granted the authority to do. I do want to point out here that agency heads shall take all necessary steps in coordination with the USDS administrator and to the maximum extent consistent with law to ensure USDS has full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems. And for those of you who are wondering what the USDS is, U.S. Digital Service. It has been reported by CNN that Musk's allies, along with the 19 to 25-year-old engineers that many of you have heard about, have been working in the building, and that most, if not all of them, apparently do not have the security clearances that are typically required. Also on January 31st, two senators, Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden, sent a letter to the Treasury Secretary demanding answers about DOGE's activities, calling for an investigation into why the DOGE team had access to these systems, and asking for an explanation of the removal of Lebrick. On then February 1st, the New York Times reported that Musk's DOGE team had already gained, quote, full access to the Treasury's payment systems late the previous day, the 31st of January. The headline was later revised to remove the word full, and that happened for a reason. Again, it's been reported that one or more members of the DOGE team had full. It's also been reported that one or more members of the DOGE team had read only. And so, according, however, to court documents, there's some clarity that's been released in some of the court documents, and I'll provide that later on in this episode. The Wall Street Journal then reported that Besant approved their access, quote, on the condition that the DOGE representatives' activity be documented and monitored. But there are, of course, questions about who will be doing the monitoring, since the Treasury Department's former Inspector General is one of the 18 Inspector Generals that were fired on January 24th. On February 2nd, Musk announced on X that his DOGE team were rapidly shutting down payments from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to certain nonprofits, and that the, quote, corruption and waste is being rooted out in real time. We don't know what those nonprofits are, and as of today, I have not seen the evidence of the corruption and waste that's being rooted out in real time. Trump then also told reporters on that same day that Musk is doing a good job and he is a cost cutter, and that sometimes we won't agree with it and will not go where he wants to go. But I think he's doing a great job. He's a smart guy, very smart, and he's very much into cutting the budget of our federal government. Meanwhile, efforts were made by Congress to revoke their access. In addition, the Alliance for Retired Americans, American Federal Government Employees, and Service Employees International Union sued the Treasury Secretary, the Treasury Department, and the Bureau of Fiscal Services to stop what they saw as, quote, unlawful, ongoing, systematic, and continuous disclosure of personal and financial information to Musk, DOGE, and others. I'm not sure what the others are. In some instances, it's been reported that one or more of the DOGE team members have full access to the Treasury's payment system or systems, with some saying that Marco Ellis specifically has administrator level privileges and has written code on two of the most sensitive systems in the U.S. government, the Payment Automation Manager and the Secure Payment System at the BFS. Others report, again, that it was just read-only access. Again, that whether it's read-only or full access has been clarified in a court document, and I'll note that later. By the way, I do want to pause and say hats off to the Wired magazine team for their consistent reporting on all of the changes. Democratic members of Congress have also introduced legislation to prohibit DOGE from tampering with federal payment systems. There have been more calls for investigations, and apparently Senator Wyden and his staff are trying to determine if DOGE is planning on loading coded data from the Treasury Department into outside servers to employ AI on it, as many reports have asserted. And so, of course, you can understand why Congress want to know exactly what's happening with that data. At a recent hearing, DOJ lawyer Brad Humphrey identified Ellis and Krause as, quote, special government employees, and stated that they only have read-only access, but that he could not verify the integrity or security of Treasury infrastructure. He specifically said, I don't know if I can say nothing has been done with information from the payment systems. So, I'm hoping that it's giving everyone a rundown of what's been happening. There's more. On February 3rd, the interim U.S. Attorney of the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, announced that his office would, quote, pursue charges against anyone who impedes DOGE's work. He also wrote that, quote, any threats, confrontations, or other actions that in any way impact their work may break numerous laws. What he did not note were what are those laws that would be broken if anyone were to impede DOGE's work. And of course, threats and confrontations or other actions. Again, we're just not certain what laws would be broken. So I'll leave that there. But I do want to quickly go back to Marco Ellis. Marco Ellis, by the way, is the DOGE member who recently resigned because of revelations of his previous, quote, racist and pro-eugenics tweets. So to round out what has happened, or what's been reported that has been happening at the Treasury Department, 19 Democratic state attorneys also filed a lawsuit accusing Trump and Besant, that's Treasury Secretary Besant, of violating federal laws and the Constitution by giving Musk's DOGE team access to Treasury's payment systems, and they are seeking to prohibit, quote, political appointees, special government employees, and any government employee detailed from an outside agency outside of the Treasury Department from accessing federal payment data and return information they obtained. So you see they're trying to cover all of the various descriptions of how DOGE is described, whether they're a political appointee or a special government employee. or in the case of actual federal employees, any federal employee that's been detailed from another federal agency. So for those of you who aren't aware, in the federal government, I'm sure there are probably other institutions as well. Um, um, you can have an employee, let's say in another department altogether, let's say someone that's, at the General Services Administration, who applies for and is granted the opportunity to do a detail in another agency. A detail is a short-term assignment in another agency because it's somehow aligned with their professional goals, or maybe they're interested in shifting to that other agency. And so that's my very simple description of what a detail is. I actually, when I worked at CDC, had a detail when I worked in one particular department within the center where I worked, and was able to do a detail in another office, because I was trying to make that transition into that other office. So just want to give you some background on that. And then 5 former Treasury secretaries published an op-ed in a recent issue of the New York Times about the, quote, risks of arbitrary and capricious political control of federal payments, which would be unlawful and corrosive to our democracy, end quote. And of course, as of Thursday, February 13th, DOGE staffer Gavin Kleiger has arrived at the Internal Revenue Service's Washington headquarters. So just want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. And Kleiger is there to, quote, examine the agency's operations. Musk, Trump, and Vance are all reportedly calling for LS to be rehired. By the way, it has been confirmed by Treasury officials in a court document this time that LS did indeed have power to edit a sensitive Treasury payment system. The words exactly were, it has been confirmed by Treasury officials in a court document that LS was mistakenly given the power to edit a sensitive Treasury payment system. Which system and what editing was done is unknown to me at this time. Meanwhile, Trump continues to condone Musk's work, or support Musk's work, and stated that Musk is, quote, finding tremendous fraud and corruption and waste. You see it with the USAID, but you're going to see it even more so with other agencies and other parts of the government. So we don't know where this will end. And what I would love to see are some of the reported, with the reports of fraud. I would love to see some of that information. Again, as a federal grant consultant, I'm always in our newsletter that we send out to our community. We do sometimes report on some of the things that we find in the news, and we try to, simplify it as much as we can as a way to help, organizations understand, how, federal grant misuse can happen. But I do want to make sure that you can see that there's a lot going on. There are many unanswered questions about the level of access the DOGE team were given to Treasury payment systems. Well, according to the court documents, LS did have more than read-only access. He had, administrator, according to others, he had administrator level access. Other concerns include that the administration is using terms such as, quote, improper payments as a workaround and an excuse to impound spending. And as a result of pressure from Senators Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden, again, the Treasury's OIG, that's the Office of Inspector General, not the actual Inspector General, because that Inspector General is one of the 18 that was terminated back on January 24th. But the Office of Inspector General, I guess that's the team that remains, said on Friday, February 14th, that it was launching an audit of the security controls for the federal government's payment system, and that the audit will also review the past 2 years of the system's transactions to address Musk's allegations of, quote, alleged fraudulent payments. That audit is expected to be done by August 2025. And of course, I'm very eager to see what comes out of that audit. So how does all of this relate to federal grants? Well, federal grantees, whether they're state and local government agencies, nonprofits, school systems, colleges and universities, and other kinds of grantees, enter their payment system, their payment information, their bank account information into federal payment systems such as ASAP, which again is a Treasury Department administered system. And they do that because they want to facilitate, electronic payments for reimbursements or advance payments to their organizations for eligible costs, for budgeted costs. So ASAP is a system overseen by the Bureau of Fiscal Service, the same BFS I mentioned earlier. How much ASAP data the DOGE team has access to, whether it's full or read only, is unknown to me at this time. In fact, there seems to be a lot of unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld. Remember him? But I do also want to take some time to give props to the press, whether it's the New York Times, again, Wired Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Business Insider, quite a few other publications, even old stalwarts such as Time Magazine. In fact, Time has published an easy-to-read summary of the systems accessed that they are aware of. So I just wanted to go ahead and quickly summarize those for you now. According to Time, the DOGE team has access to the Federal Aviation Administration's technologies to, quote, facilitate rapid safety upgrades. Number two, they have access to student loan data at the U.S. Department of Education. They've accessed the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services IT systems to scrutinize spending across Medicare and Medicaid. They've accessed the Department of Energy's basic IT systems that was accessed by that the 23-year-old member of the DOGE team. A lot of folks are concerned about this since the Department of Energy systems include information about the country's nuclear energy systems. They've also accessed the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency's contracting system that has information on millions of dollars in federal contracts. And then there's the FEMA issue. So what happened at FEMA? So according to what's been reported, FEMA's sensitive data systems has also been accessed, including private information about disaster survivors. This access is having consequences, seemingly with not a lot of information about the reason for the consequences. For example, 4 FEMA officials, specifically FEMA's chief financial officer, 2 program analysts, and a grant specialist were fired by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security after Musk announced on X. So again, Elon Musk announced on a social media platform that DOGE uncovered millions of dollars being spent illegally by FEMA to house migrants in New York City, and that the money was intended for American disaster relief was spent on, quote, high-end hotels. Since then, U.S. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced, I have clawed back the full payment. So that actually answers my question that I mentioned earlier in the episode. Who actually, clawed back the funding? Kristi Noem has, of course, come forward and said that she actually clawed back or authorized someone to claw back the $80 million or so that you've heard about in the news that was clawed back from New York City. The policies they violated have not been detailed, but it is reported that they allegedly circumvented leadership and made the payments. So as a federal grant professional and consultant, I have some questions and easy ways that I would dig into this. Here's something else about the situation that caught my eye as a federal grant consultant, if what was reported is accurate. One thing that we should know is that FEMA administers many grant programs. Like all grant-making agencies, they administer many programs. And all of these programs have titles. And they have other information to help grantees and the agencies know the difference between the different programs. So FEMA does administer the Shelter and Services Program in partnership with the Customs and Border Protection. This funding provides aid to cities sheltering migrants. And last year, Congress appropriated $650 million for that program. The program, not necessarily the grant to New York City. So the grant to New York City may have been a part of that $650 million. However, as I mentioned earlier, rumors have been hovering around and bandied about that FEMA was using disaster relief money to fund the Shelter and Services Program. As a federal grant consultant, there are ways to easily determine which is which. So that story, I believe, brings up even more unknowns. But I think I'll end this episode by quoting both Judge Jeanette Vargas and Andrew Amer of the New York Attorney General's office. Judge Vargas will or has issued a decision on an extension of a temporary restraining order requested by Democratic state attorneys general to prevent DOGE from accessing Treasury Department data. In response to federal government lawyers' arguments that DOGE staffers are, acting appropriately, she asked, why so rushed? I think that's a great question. Why the rush? Lawyers for the attorneys general also pointed out that there was no effort to remove or redact private individual information, and there's no evidence that DOGE staff were given proper training on how to handle such sensitive data. I think that's a great point. I think I'll really end, though, by pointing out that one of the attorneys from the New York Attorney General's office then noted that states have had their bank account information accessed by people with no reason to access it. If you found this video valuable, please do 3 things. Press the like button, subscribe, and share it as far and wide as possible so that people that you think would be interested in understanding what has happened at the Treasury Department in terms of the DOGE team's access to these federal payment systems. If you think they'll be interested, please share this information with them. Again, if there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover or something you'd like me to add about this particular topic, or even something I misreported, you can certainly drop that in the comments. I'd also like for you to please check out the links in the description below to learn about my consulting firm, GrantsWorks, and to learn about GrantsWorks Academy, including our federal grant funding and management training series. This 3-module training is CFRE and GPCI certified with other certifications underway. This training does help you better understand federal grant, how they're awarded, about some of the systems used by federal grantees, and about grantees' responsibilities. I also linked to the resources and articles I used to prepare for this episode so you can check them out for yourself. I hope I provided a decent summary of what's been happening in terms of the DOGE team's access to federal payment systems at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.